Hello everyone, this is Sadia Malik and today we are going to talk about the preface to Lyrical Ballads. I'm going to go through the text and also explain it paragraph to paragraph. Please remember it's more like a comment on the text and not a full explanation with analysis. So for that you can look at my channel for a previous introduction about preface to Lyrical Ballads. So this is how the text starts. The first two paragraphs are about Wordsworth telling his readership that his lyrical ballads, the book which contained almost 24 poems, 19 by Wordsworth and 4 by Coleridge, and later on Wordsworth added even more poems. It was a good experiment, and Wordsworth was happy to note that it proved to be popular beyond his expectations. So he wasn't expecting the readership to react to the book in this way, but he was quite happy because he says the result has differed from my expectation in this only, that I have pleased a greater number than I ventured I hope I should please. So more people were happy with the way he wrote because he was quite apprehensive about the reaction coming from the readership. Please remember that this has come at a time when the people were quite used to reading poetry which was very superficial and very linguistically difficult, because it was very verbose and the language was very decorated. So in the midst of it came lyrical ballad, which had topics which were very common and the language which was much simpler than what people were actually used to reading. So in the third paragraph, the rationale comes in. So actually, who told him to write about it? So it's Wordsworth's friends who had wanted him to write a preface to the poems. He could offer a defense of the theory behind writing his poetry, so he could explain why he wrote them. The poems obviously were very different as far as the kind was concerned, and this was a place where he could have explained his aims and objectives in the preface. But Wordsworth says that he was quite unwilling himself to write a preface for two reasons, and he has given those two reasons here. Number one, that he thinks that his attempt might be suspected or trying to offer argument as to why the public should like his poem. So he thought that maybe he'll be blowing his own trumpet and he would be asking people or manipulating his readership to actually like his poems. But the second reason was much more important. He believed that the space offered by a normal preface was too short, and this was not a place for an adequate defense of the theory of the new kind of poetry that he was writing. So he believed that this was a preface. This was supposed to come before the poems, and if you make it too lengthy, the poems would be overshadowed. So this was not a right place to actually give his theory. So he was not willing himself, because he's saying here, but I was unwilling to undertake the task because I knew that on this occasion the reader would look coldly upon my argument, since I might be suspected of having been principally influenced by selfish and foolish hope of reasoning him into an approbation. Approbation means liking of these particular poems, and I was still more unwilling to undertake the task because adequately to display my opinion and fully to enforce my argument would require a space wholly disproportionate to the nature of the preface. So he realized that this canvas was not broader enough for his purpose. So next we move to the fourth paragraph. Even at the end of the third paragraph, he says, I have therefore altogether declined to enter regularly upon this defense, yet I am sensible that there would be some impropriety in abruptly obtruding upon the public, without a few words of introduction, poems so materially different from those upon which the general approbation is at present bestowed. So he believes that this is not a defense, this is not like a manipulation, so the reader would like my poems, but I think that because my poems are so different from the ones that the people have been reading, so it was quite right for me, it was quite appropriate for me to actually write a small little introduction of why I'm writing these kind of poems. So then we move to the next paragraph, and here comes the chief aim of writing poems. So here he says that my chief aim was to actually select incidents and situations of common life, and he has to relate these incidents to the language really used by men. So the basic idea was twofold. Number one, that the poems should be based on incidents and situations which are selected from common life, very common incidents. not very abstract or hyperbolic. And the second was more emphasis was on the selection of language, because you can say that one thing that comes out of the preface is Wordsworth challenging the norm of neoclassical era of using language in a very different way. So he brought the language down to the common people and he made it simpler, used less literary devices in his poems, but somehow the reader thought that maybe he's a lazy poet and he doesn't want to work on his art. So he is explaining that the art of poetry is not dependent on very difficult language or very abstract situations that common people cannot relate to. So you need to bring it down. And he is giving examples from different poems, from different poets' life also, that they have also done it. So because people are accustomed to the phraseology of Pope, because Pope came towards the end and he was one of the most popular neoclassical poets. So he said that maybe they are going to reject my poems because of that. And they are going to find something lacking in my poems. So he is going to explain that difference. And the preface was in nature of more like an introduction as far as his poems is concerned. So he is referring to different poems there and how everybody has just one aim in mind, and that was to please the public. Now here comes the chief aim. So the principal object then, which I proposed to myself in this poem, was to choose incidents and situations from common life and to relate or describe them throughout, as far as possible, in a selection of language rarely used by men, and at the same time throw over them a certain coloring of imagination, whereby ordinary things should be presented to a mind in a very unusual way, and further and above all, to make these incidents and situations interesting by tracing in them truly throughout, not ostentatiously, the primary laws of our nature. So this paragraph is very important because he gives reason also why he is choosing the rustic language, and he gives here the choice. Low and rustic life was generally chosen because in that condition the essential passions of the heart find a better soil in which they can attain their maturity, are less under restraint, speak a plainer and more emphatic language, because in that condition, that is the rustic life, our elementary feelings coexist in a state of greater simplicity and consequently may be more accurately contemplated and more forcibly communicated, because the manners of rural life germinate from those elementary feelings and from the necessary character of rural occupation, are more easily comprehended and are more durable. And lastly, because in that condition, the passions of men are incorporated with the beautiful permanent forms of nature. So this is where he is giving his reasons, and he has chosen the humble and rustic life for a number of reasons. Number one, in it the essential passions of human heart found a free, unrestrained, plain and powerful expression. So they do not pretend, they say what they want to say. In rustic life, the feelings are simpler and so are more forcefully expressed because the exposure is less. So they are more straightforward in expressing whatever they feel. Number three is the manners of the rustic life are simpler and hence more easily understood and more durable. So that can be a subjective opinion because everybody does not see to agree with the same idea, but he believed that the manners, the way they lived their life was much simpler and hence it could be easily understood by any reader. And lastly, he believes that in the humble condition, the passions of men are closely connected with the beautiful and permanent form of nature. So this is where the pantheism concept comes in, where Wordsworth believed that nature is an integral part of human beings, and the people who live close to nature, they are much more well versed in expressing their emotions in a proper way rather than people who live away from nature, especially in the cities. So they are under influence of a lot of artificiality and superficiality. So they do not express their emotions very clearly. But this is where the problem comes in. The language too of these men is adopted, and then in the bracket he says, purified indeed from appears to be its real defects from all lasting and rational causes of dislike or disgust. Because such men hardly communicate with the best object from which the best part of language originally derived. Two problems basically here. Number one is the bracket thing, that although he says that I'm going to adopt the language of the rustics, but purified indeed from what appears to be its real defects. But he said that I'm going to purify it, sift it, make a selection out of it. So I'm going to take out everything which is which causes disgust or dislike or anything which is rough around the edges, which is crude around the edges. So I'm going to take that out and then I'm going to adopt it. And the other thing is the use of best. I mean, he says the best object from which the best part of language is originally derived. When you go through a certain language and call that the best part of any language, and some language to be called the best for poetry, you are using superlatives, which does not leave a lot of room for other opinions and other choices. So this is where he exaggerated a little bit, and this is where Coleridge also reprimanded him by saying that this is now how he should have gone through it. He should have used common language. The language of the common people should have been a better choice. But to say the rustic language is the best is just a very subjective opinion. So this is, in this paragraph, he's basically defending his choice that a simple language in which they convey their feeling, the rustics, is more permanent and philosophical than the artificial diction used by poets of his time. So this is where he's giving the reason. A very important paragraph. That is why I have highlighted it fully. Then we come to the next paragraph, and this is where, he's defending why his poems are different. So Wordsworth's poems differ from those of his contemporary because his poems have a worthy purpose. So he's saying that a lot of people actually label my poems as trivial or mean. Mean means very base, very common. And they said that my thought and the language that I have used in my poems both are very trivial and very mean. But this is because they have been used to reading poems which are very superficial in nature, very arbitrary in nature, false refinement and arbitrary. So that this is not the fault of the reader, because they have been attuned, they have been accustomed, they have been used to reading poems which were very superficial. So he believes that his poems are better because they have a worthy purpose. And what is the worthy purpose? Of enlightening the readers and purifying their affections. So he has taken up a job, and he feels that my poems, see here, each of them has a worthy purpose. Not that I mean to say that I always began to write with a distinct purpose formally conceived, but I believe that my habits of meditation have so formed my feelings as that my description of such objects as strongly excite these feelings and will be found to carry along with them as a purpose. And then he comes to his definition, the famous definition of poetry, that for all good poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, but though this be true, poems to which any value can be attached were never produced on any variety of subjects but by a man who, being possessed of more than usual organic sensibility and also thought long and deeply. So he believes that the poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling, that the poet has more than usual organic sensibility. He uses his sense much more elaborately than common people do. He has also thought long and deeply, and he has a habit in him formed which some purpose become prominent aim of his composition. So that meditation helps him to write better. And he also believed that the true poet always discovers what is really important and worthwhile. So just writing poetry is not enough. The purpose has to be attached to it. Even when you are writing something very spontaneously coming to you, your process of thinking about it long and deep, that is going to make it more purposeful. So here he is just mentioning the poems that he has written, and he has said that I have gone for simpler and more relatable events, and in order to convey to the reader in a proper way, I have used language which is equally simpler and equally filled with feeling. So he basically believed that the language of a poem should match with the purpose of the poem. If the poem has been written on something very abstract, very sublime topic, then the language should match that. But if you are writing on something which is very common, for example, mad mother, idiot boy, etc., so the language has to come down, and it has to match with the theme of the poem. So he talks about different poems that he has written, and then he says that as far as my reader is concerned, I should assert myself that my poems, because I have used a simpler language, are not mean or baser in any way. So I have made them more worthwhile by giving them a reason that the reader has to look at. The more effective of these causes are the great national events which are daily taking place, and the increasing accumulation of men in cities. So he realizes that now the taste is changing People want to read something different, and I am taking care of that kind of shift in the readership, and that is why these poems are fit for this time and this era. Okay, so the next thing is that we are going to patch up paragraph number 11, 10, 11 and 12 together, because almost the topic is the same. In his time, in Wordsworth's time, there was a great distinction between prose and poem. And because of the neoclassical critics, especially Samuel Johnson and the likes of him, they totally rejected any poem which had even a single line which looked like prose. So there was a great censure, and you can say a great rejection of poems in which even one or two lines were written in the matter of prose, etc. So basically the background of these three paragraphs is that very same criticism, that it is not necessary that a poem should totally be in meter. There might be a series of lines in which they look totally like prose, and it is fine, because as far as the purpose of the poem is concerned, if those lines are fulfilling that purpose, it doesn't really matter if those one or two lines are actually in prose. So he basically says that even in the best poetry, there are passages which have an order of words which is similar to that found in good prose. So basically the difference between poetry and prose is meter, and in poetry you usually use a relaxed grammar, whereas in prose you need to have a proper syntax of writing sentences. So he says that it is not ordinary, it is not something wrong if you find a series of prose lines, a series of lines, or even a single line in which the language, though naturally arranged and according to the strict law of meter, does not differ from that of prose. There are numerous class of critics who then stumble upon these proisism, as they call them, imagine that they have made a notable discovery, and exult over the poet as over a man ignorant of his own profession. So they usually call that man ignorant of his profession. They call that you do not know how to write poetry. And because of that criticism, a lot of poets, they were actually very discouraged because they could not strictly separate prose from poetry. So Wordsworth gives a claim which was very controversial, and he says that it is impossible to write poetry in which there aren't any lines which look like prose. But to the extent, because he exaggerates on every point, he says, but likewise that some of the most interesting part of the best poems will be found to be strictly the language of prose when prose is well written. So again he gives a claim which is very controversial, and it invited a lot of criticism from different fields of literature and literary criticism, because he said basically that there is no difference between prose and poetry, and he says the only difference between prose and poetry is meter. So he gives different arguments here. He also refers to one of the sonnets written by Thomas Gray. It was written in 1742. Thomas Gray was one of the proto-romantics. He came before Wordsworth, and he was severely criticized for these lines that he used to inject in his poems which look like prose. So he said that he italicized 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines, and he says that these lines were criticized to be prosic, looked like prose or sounded like prose. A different object do these eyes require, my lonely anguish melts no heart but mine, and in my breast the imperfect joys expire. And then in the last two lines, I fruitless moan to him that cannot hear, and weep the more because I weep in vain. So these lines were highlighted as being prosic or prose-like, and they were called non-poetic. So Wordsworth is basically saying that it will be easily perceived that the only part of the sonnet which is of any value is the lines printed in italics, and it is equally obvious that except in rhyme and in the use of the single word fruitless for fruitlessly, which is so far a defect, the language of these lines does in no respect differ from that of prose. So he gives you a hypothesis, and he says that there neither is nor can be any essential difference between the language of prose and that of metrical composition. And he feels the only difference is that poetry uses meter. Otherwise, the same human blood circulates through the veins of both poetry and prose, and they are related with one another. And as far as their nature, function, and appeal is concerned, the only difference is that in prose we use a proper syntax, whereas in poetry we have meter and we have the poetic license to use words out of their syntactical arrangement. So he, in this paragraph, this is paragraph number 12, he propounds that very controversial statement by saying here, And I have previously asserted that a large portion of the language of every good poem can in no respect differ from that of good prose. I will go further. I do not doubt that it may be safely affirmed that there neither is nor can be any essential difference between the language of prose and metrical composition. So he believes that the only difference is meter, and that difference is not that great. And other than that, the language is the same, the thought process is the same. Both are trying to communicate their ideas and their feelings to the reader. So they should not be separated that strictly. And he gives you examples that there have been instances where poetry and painting have been compared together, and there were some similar themes found in poetry and painting as far as form and medium and expression is concerned. So why not prose and poetry, which are basically offshoots of literature? So if there can be similarities between painting and poetry, which are totally different genres, totally different mediums, why can't there be affinity and similarity between poetry and prose? Why are poetry and prose so strictly separated from one another? So, but in order to bridge this gap, he has propounded a theory which is very controversial, because he cannot say that there is an essential difference between prose and poetry, and that is meter. Even if there is one difference, that one difference is enough to separate two things separately. So you can't say that A is equal to B, but B is not equal to A. So if prose is equal to poetry, is poetry is equal to prose also? It's not, because poetry has meter and prose has not. So as far as the language is concerned, we might take his argument that yes, he is right, because both employ language and both try to write on a certain purpose in mind, that both are addressing to the reader, both are using language to express their feelings and their opinions. But as far as the difference is concerned, he cannot say that there is neither is nor can be essential difference, because there is an essential difference between the two, and that is meter. So you have to highlight this portion, and you have to say that he was wrong in asserting that there is no difference, because this very portion of the preface, it attracted a lot of criticism from different people, including Coleridge. Coleridge was also against this. He believed that there was a difference. And even if there is a difference of one thing, that one thing is enough to create a difference between the two. So basically what Wordsworth were trying to say is that don't judge people who are using one or two lines of good prose in their poetry, because that was the criteria of criticism at that time. But again, in trying to make his point, he went a little overboard, and he believed that no, there is no difference between the two. And it, as I already told you, it was a very controversial claim. And he says, poetry shed no tears such as angels weep, but nature in human tears. She can boast of no celestial ichor. Ichor is the blood of the gods, as Greek mythology believed in it. That distinguishes her vital juices from that of prose. The same human blood circulates through the veins of them both. So he believes that prose and poetry basically are the offshoot of the same literature. So you cannot differentiate them too much from one another. But he goes one step further by saying that there is no difference between the two at all. And he also believes, this is paragraph number 13, he also believes that poetry is distinguished by the use of selection of language rarely spoken by men. He says that you should not be looking for whether the poet has some lines of prose or not, but you should be looking at language, because the language is the essential difference. And poetry, as I am recommending, is as far as possible a selection of the language rarely spoken by men. That this selection, wherever is made with true taste and feeling, will itself form a distinction far greater than that would be at first imagined, and will entirely separate the composition from the vulgarity meanness of ordinary life. He says it does not really matter if something looks like prose or looks like poetry. You should be more concerned about the language that is being used, and the language has to be of common men, of simple men, that he calls the real men. So that is why he believes that there is no need to use artificial devices or foreign splendor. He says that the passion and emotions is what it really matters, and a proper choice of subject would lead the poet to appropriate passions also. And if the passions and emotions are elevated, the diction should suit that. But if the passions and emotions are common and natural, the language should be chosen according to that. And because he believes that he writes from the heart, and he chose simple situations from ordinary life, he believes that his language is going to be free from all the artificiality, all the gaudiness of inane phraseology of the neoclassicism, because his themes are simple and his language is going to be simpler. So this is where he takes us. So I'm on paragraph number 14 now, and from paragraph 14 a very important topic emerges from the preface to Lyrical Ballet, that is the definition of a poet according to Wordsworth. So paragraph number 14 and 15 both deal with what a poet is and how he works and how his mind works. So this is important as far as your quotations are concerned. You can take your quotations from here. And he says, what is a poet? To whom does he address himself? And then the answer comes, he is a man speaking to men. A man, it's true, endued with more lively sensibility, more enthusiasm, tenderness, and who has a greater knowledge of human nature and a more comprehensive soul that are supposed to be common among mankind. A man pleased with his own passions and volitions, and who rejoices more than other men in the spirit of life that is in him, delighting to contemplate similar volition and passions as manifested in the ongoing of the universe. So all these qualities are there, and he believes that the concept of the poet is that he is a man speaking to men, meaning ordinary language, though he is bestowed with higher sensibility. So he must have a higher sensibility, much more elaborate. He has a greater knowledge of human nature and a more comprehensive soul than the average human being. So he contemplates things that common people do not. He can sympathize and feel for others. So empathy is very important. It's not necessary that the poet has to go through all the experiences himself, but he should have that strong empathy to feel for others. He has the greater powers of communication. A lot of people, me and you, we feel a lot of things, but we are unable to communicate it in proper language. So the poets are gifted with that powers of communication. So he has to have that. He has disposition to be affected by things absent as if they were present. So he's basically talking about imagination, that the poets are gifted with a very powerful and very potent imagination. They can think of scenarios and they can think of situations that we can't actually think of. And he can express these thoughts and feelings in much better way, which he is feeling. So a lot of time we are feeling something, but we can't say it in words. We say that I'm speechless, I do not know what to say. But the poets should not have that kind of handicap, because they know how to put their feelings in words. They know how to put their feelings on paper. And even when there is no external stimulation, even then they are supposed to write about their emotions. That, according to him, is the proper definition of a poet. Ability of conjuring up in himself passions which are indeed far from being the same as those produced by real events. So conjuring up means that he can make these events up, he can imagine them without even going through them himself, because it is impossible for a single poet to go through all different kinds of emotions. And then he has acquired a greater readiness and power in expressing what he thinks and feels, especially those thoughts and feelings which by his own choice or from the structure of his own mind arise in him without immediate external excitement. So he should have the power to communicate whatever he feels in a proper way, using proper characters, using adequate language, and decorating it with meter. So a poet should have all that powers in him. So we are going to stop here. We have finished till paragraph 15. The qualities continue in paragraph 15 also. And he believes that so that it will be the wish of the poet to bring his feelings near to those of the persons whose feelings he described, nay, for short spaces of time, perhaps to let himself slip into an entire delusion, even confound and identify his feelings with theirs. So the poet should have the ability to lose himself in characters. So he should become what his characters are. So if the character is elevated, very educated, very polished, then the poet should speak like that person. But if the characters have been taken from common life, like a shepherd or a reaper, like in a solitary reaper, it's a simple girl who's reaping the corn, or any fisherman, etc., or any woman who has been taken from village life. The feelings should be of that person. So the poet should be able to slip in the character and think like them and speak like them and act like them. So he takes on the character of that very person that he is trying to portray. So we're going to stop here. These are the 15 paragraphs, and we are going to continue with paragraph 16 onwards. Remember, there are 34 paragraphs in the preface, so we are going to conclude it in the next lecture. If you have any questions, please do ask, and like and comment, and also subscribe to my channel. Thank you.